The most polite bobcat ever asked to be petted. He knows exactly how to get love. Frank Peterson sat motionless in his worn armchair, autumn sunlight streaming through the window of the Cedar Grove Wildlife Sanctuary. Beside him, on a small cushion that had become his throne, Archie the bobcat stretched one spotted paw and gently placed it on Frank's weathered hand. The old man's eyes, which had been dry for months, suddenly brimmed with tears as the wild creature began to purr, a sound like distant thunder, like life itself returning to a heart that had forgotten how to beat with joy. The moment that brought them together had been anything but gentle. 3 months earlier, Frank had been driving down Route 202 on one of those crisp Vermont afternoons when the maples burn orange and the air carries the promise of winter. He'd been returning from Greenwood Cemetery, where he'd spent the morning sitting beside Margaret's headstone, talking to her about everything and nothing, the way married people do even when one of them can no longer answer back. The house they'd shared for 37 years felt cavernous now, filled with her absence. And these cemetery visits had become Frank's way of holding on to something that felt real and permanent in a world that suddenly seemed fragile. The truck had come around the bend too fast, its driver probably checking his phone or reaching for coffee. Frank saw it all happen in slow motion, the mother bobcat stepping into the road, perhaps chasing prey or simply crossing to better hunting grounds. The sickening thud, the truck barely slowing before disappearing around the next curve, leaving behind only the acrid smell of burning rubber and a scene that would haunt Frank's dreams for weeks to come. But it was what came after the impact that broke Frank's heart completely. A tiny bobcat kitten, no bigger than a house cat, emerged from the roadside brush with blood matting its spotted coat. The little creature approached its mother's still form with tentative steps, mewing in a way that sounded almost like questions. "Mama, mama, why won't you get up?" The kitten nudged the lifeless body with its nose, circled it once, twice, then sat down and began to cry, a sound so human, so utterly bereft, that Frank found himself pulling over without conscious thought. His hands shook as he dialed the number for Vermont Fish and Wildlife, then the Cedar Grove Wildlife Sanctuary. While he waited for help to arrive, Frank watched the kitten from his car, noting how it refused to leave its mother's side even as other vehicles passed by. The little one would dart away when a car approached, then return the moment the coast was clear, as if hoping this time, Mama would wake up. There was something in that small creature's grief that Frank recognized with painful clarity, the same desperate vigil he'd kept beside Margaret's hospital bed during her final weeks, watching and waiting and hoping for impossibilities. When Dr. Emily Carter arrived in the sanctuary's rescue van, Frank helped her carefully collect both the mother and her orphaned baby. The kitten hissed and spat at the veterinarian, but when Frank spoke to it in the same gentle tone he'd once used to calm Margaret during her worst days in the hospital, the little creature's ears flicked forwards with something that might have been curiosity. "He's badly injured," Dr. Carter said, examining the kitten in her mobile clinic. "Broken leg, probably some cracked ribs and internal bruising. He would have died out here within days." She looked at Frank, who was still wearing his cemetery visiting clothes. The navy suit Margaret had always said brought out his eyes, the tie she'd given him for their last anniversary together. "You probably saved his life." Frank nodded, but he couldn't shake the image of the kitten's desperate vigil beside its mother. As Dr. Carter prepared to transport the animals back to the sanctuary, Frank found himself asking about volunteer opportunities. The words surprised him even as he spoke them. He hadn't planned to get involved beyond making the rescue call. "We could always use more hands," Dr. Carter said, studying Frank's face with the keen eye of someone accustomed to reading both human and animal behavior. "Especially someone with patience. This little fellow is going to need a long recovery, and he'll probably be difficult to handle after trauma like this." That evening, Frank called the sanctuary to check on the kitten's condition. The next morning, he called again. By the third day, Dr. Carter was gently suggesting that perhaps Frank should come in for a proper volunteer orientation. "I think you need us as much as we need you," she said with characteristic directness. Frank had been retired from his job at the hardware store for 5 years, and since Margaret's death 6 months ago, his days had become an endless succession of quiet meals, old television shows, and long drives to nowhere in particular. The house they'd shared felt like a museum now, every room holding memories that brought as much pain as comfort. He tried reading, tried gardening, tried visiting with their old friends, but everything felt hollow, performed rather than lived. Margaret had been the social one, the planner, the one who filled their calendar with activities and obligations that had seemed burdensome at the time but now revealed themselves as the scaffolding that had held his world together. So on a gray morning in early November, Frank found himself walking through the doors of Cedar Grove Wildlife Sanctuary as an official volunteer, wearing the same careful expression he'd worn to Margaret's funeral, determined to be helpful, trying not to be a burden, hoping no one would notice how lost he felt without the woman who had been his compass for nearly 4 decades. Dr. Carter gave him the tour, explaining the sanctuary's mission to rehabilitate injured wildlife and return them to their natural habitats. They housed everything from injured raptors to orphaned bear cubs, each animal requiring specialized care and attention. The facility hummed with purposeful activity, staff members checking on patients, preparing meals, administering medications, maintaining enclosures. Frank found the atmosphere both overwhelming and oddly comforting. Here was a place where suffering had meaning, where healing was not just hoped for, but actively pursued. They saved the newest patient for last. "This is our most challenging case right now," Dr. Carter said, stopping before a large pen where a small bobcat sat in the farthest corner. Golden eyes fixed on the approaching humans. The enclosure was equipped with both indoor and outdoor spaces, climbing structures, and hiding places. But the young bobcat had chosen the most secluded corner, as far from human contact as possible. The kitten from Route 202, we've named him Archie. The moment Frank saw those eyes, he knew. This was his little grief keeper, the one who had stood vigil beside his mother just as Frank had sat beside Margaret's hospital bed during those terrible final weeks. Archie had grown in the weeks since the accident. His spotted coat was fuller now, his injured leg encased in a small cast that Dr. Carter assured Frank was healing well. But there was something in his posture, in the way he held himself apart from the world. That spoke to Frank of a deeper wound than broken bones could account for. "He's been extremely difficult," Dr. Carter admitted, her voice carrying the frustration of someone accustomed to success with wild animals. "Won't let most of the staff near him without aggressive displays. Hisses, spits, swipes with his claws. We've had to sedate him for most of his medical treatments, which isn't ideal for a young animal's development. Some of the staff are starting to worry that he might not be releasable if he doesn't learn to cope with stress better." She paused, studying Frank's face with the same clinical attention she gave her animal patients. "But there's something different about the way he's looking at you, usually. When strangers approach, he retreats even further or starts posturing aggressively. But look at him now." Frank stepped closer to the enclosure, and Archie's ears swiveled forward with obvious interest. The bobcat rose from his corner and approached the fence with careful, measured steps, not the prowling gait of a predator preparing to defend himself, but something more deliberate, more curious. "Hey there, little fellow," Frank said softly, using the same tone he'd used at the accident scene. "Remember me, I'm the one who called for help when you needed it most." Archie stopped just out of arm's reach and sat down, wrapping his spotted tail around his front paws in a gesture that somehow managed to be both feline and regal. But instead of the aggressive posturing the staff had described, he simply looked at Frank, really looked at him, with those golden eyes that seemed far too old and knowing for such a young creature. Then Archie did something that made Dr. Carter gasp audibly. He blinked, slowly, deliberately, both eyes closing and opening in what any cat owner would recognize as the feline equivalent of a kiss, a gesture of trust and affection that cats reserve for those they consider family. "I've never seen him do that," Dr. Carter whispered, her professional composure cracking with amazement. "Not once, not with anyone. He barely tolerates the staff who feed him, and he's never shown any sign of recognizing humans as anything other than threats." Frank felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of the tight knot of grief that had lived there since Margaret's last breath. Without thinking, he knelt beside the fence and extended his hand, palm up, fingers relaxed in a gesture of offering rather than demand. Archie studied Frank's hand for a long moment, his golden eyes moving from the extended fingers to Frank's face and back again, as if evaluating not just the immediate offer but the man behind it. Then, with a deliberation that suggested conscious choice rather than instinct, Archie rose and approached the fence. He pressed his small pink nose against Frank's fingers through the chain link, sniffing carefully, learning Frank's scent. After a moment of this careful investigation, Archie slowly walked closer and sat at a short distance from Frank's hand, close enough to touch but maintaining his autonomy. Then he blinked again, that slow, gentle closing of eyes that spoke of trust given freely rather than earned through dominance. "Well," Dirk Carter said after a long moment of stunned silence, "I think we found Archie's person." The sanctuary staff were initially divided about this unusual bond. Some worried that Archie's attachment to Frank might prevent him from developing the natural wariness of humans necessary for eventual release back into the wild. Others questioned whether a grieving widower was emotionally equipped to handle the challenges of rehabilitating a traumatized wild animal. But Frank insisted on being part of Archie's rehabilitation process, convinced that their connection represented a healing opportunity for both of them. "I've spent the last 6 months feeling like I was already dead," Frank told Dr. Carter during one of their planning sessions. "That little fellow has been through the same kind of loss I have. Maybe we can help each other figure out how to live again." Dr. Carter, who had seen enough in her years of wildlife rehabilitation to respect the mysterious bonds that sometimes formed between species, agreed to let Frank take a primary role in Archie's care. The decision would prove to be one of the most important of both their lives. Archie's injuries were more complex than they had initially appeared. Along with the broken leg, X-rays revealed cracked ribs and internal bruising that required surgical intervention. Dr. Carter scheduled the operation for a Thursday morning, warning Frank that the procedure would be delicate and that recovery would be slow and uncertain. On the morning of the surgery, Frank arrived at the sanctuary before dawn, carrying a thermos of coffee and a worn paperback novel, Margaret's favorite, a romance she'd read dozens of times and had always claimed helped her through difficult days. He found Archie awake in his enclosure, as if the young Bobcat had sensed that this day would be different from the others. "Today's going to be hard, little gentleman," Frank said softly, settling into the chair that had been placed near Archie's enclosure for their daily reading sessions. The nickname had come to him naturally. It was what Margaret used to call him when he was being particularly endearing, usually when he was trying to charm his way out of some minor household transgression. The endearment seemed perfect for this gentle Bobcat who conducted himself with such quiet dignity despite his circumstances. Dr. Carter performed the surgery while Frank stayed by Archie's side throughout the procedure, maintaining a constant stream of quiet conversation. He told Archie about Margaret, how they'd met at a church social when Frank was 22 and she was 20, how she'd laughed at his terrible jokes and somehow seen past his awkwardness to something worth loving. He described their first apartment, barely bigger than Archie's enclosure, and how they'd made it feel like a palace with nothing but love and secondhand furniture. "His vital signs are more stable when you're talking," Dr. Carter observed during the most delicate part of the procedure. "His heart rate stays steady, blood pressure, normal. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." So Frank kept talking. He told Archie about Margaret's garden, how she could make anything grow with enough patience and love. He described their Sunday morning routine, pancakes and coffee, and the newspaper spread between them on the kitchen table, arguing gently about politics and planning their day together. He talked about her final months, the hospital visits and the quiet conversations about fear and love, and what it meant to say goodbye to someone you couldn't imagine living without. When Archie finally woke up from the anesthesia 3 hours later, groggy and probably in considerable pain, the first thing he saw was Frank's face. The Bobcat's eyes were unfocused at first, struggling against the lingering effects of the medication. But when Frank spoke to him in that same gentle tone, those golden eyes focused immediately with what could only be described as relief. "You're okay, little gentleman," Frank whispered, his own eyes bright with tears he hadn't expected. "The hard part's over now. We're both going to be okay." Recovery was slow and sometimes frustrating. Archie's leg needed to be immobilized for weeks, and the young Bobcat chafed against the restrictions, clearly eager to move and explore, but forced into unnatural stillness. Frank began writing in a nightly journal, recording every small behavior Archie exhibited, whether he ate enough, whether he purred when petted, whether he seemed to be in pain, whether he showed interest in the toys and enrichment items the staff provided. Day 3 post-surgery. Archie ate half his portion this morning, which Dr. Carter says is normal, when I scratched behind his ears. He closed his eyes and leaned into my hand, reminded me of Margaret during her chemotherapy treatments, how she'd find comfort in small gestures of care. Strange how expressions of love are the same across species. Day 8, Archie took his first tentative steps without favoring his injured leg. Still careful, testing each step. But there's determination in his eyes, the same stubborn refusal to let setbacks define him that I saw in Margaret when she was learning to walk again after her hip surgery. Some spirits just refuse to be broken. Day 12 caught Archie performing today, pretending to limp when he thought I wasn't watching, then walking normally when he didn't think he needed sympathy. Made me laugh out loud for the first time since Margaret's funeral. She would have loved his theatrical streak. Each day, Frank arrived at the sanctuary early, settling beside Archie's recovery pen with whatever book he'd chosen for their daily reading session. The staff had initially been skeptical of this routine, wondering if a wild animal could really benefit from being read to. But Archie's obvious enjoyment of these sessions convinced even the doubters. The Bobcat would position himself as close to Frank as his enclosure allowed, often settling into what appeared to be a listening posture, his golden eyes alert and focused on Frank's face, as Archie's mobility improved. Dr. Carter arranged for him to have access to a larger space that included a designated reading area, a small room with comfortable furniture, where Frank and Archie could spend time together without the barriers of fencing. Archie was given his own special chair in this room, a small cushion placed beside Frank's armchair that the Bobcat claimed immediately and defended jealously from the facility's resident cats. At exactly 3 o'clock each afternoon, the two would settle into their respective chairs for what became known around the sanctuary as story time. Frank would read aloud from whatever book he'd brought, sometimes mysteries, sometimes biographies, sometimes the romance novels that had been Margaret's favorites, while Archie listened with the focused attention of a devoted student. The young Bobcat would tap Frank's hand gently with his paw when he wanted attention. Always politely, never demanding, conducting himself with a grace that charmed everyone who witnessed these sessions. As Archie's personality emerged more fully during his recovery, his playful side became increasingly apparent. Sometimes he would act for Frank's benefit, pretending to limp or wince when Frank wasn't paying close attention, as if to say, "I'm hurt, pet me." Once sufficiently comforted and fussed over, he would dash around his enclosure with obvious delight, as if he'd never been injured at all. The sanctuary staff began to recognize these theatrical moments as signs of Archie's growing confidence and trust. One evening, after a particularly long reading session, Archie dozed off in his cushioned chair and began to emit soft, steady snores that were remarkably similar to the sounds Frank himself made during his occasional afternoon naps. The visiting volunteers that evening burst into delighted laughter when they heard the gentle rumbling. "Two old men snoring, how absolutely adorable," one of them exclaimed, and the comparison stuck. From that day forward, Frank and Archie were known around the sanctuary as the two gentlemen, a pair of souls who had found comfort and companionship in each other's presence. The depth of their bond became most apparent when Frank's own health concerns forced a temporary separation. His doctor had found some irregularities in Frank's blood work during a routine physical elevated blood pressure, signs of stress that suggested he needed more comprehensive testing. The prospect of hospitals and medical procedures filled Frank with dread, not because he feared for his own life, but because the medical world reminded him too vividly of Margaret's final months. "I need you to take care of yourself," Dr. Carter told Frank firmly when he tried to minimize the importance of the tests. "Archie needs you healthy and present. You won't be helping him by ignoring your own medical needs." During Frank's month-long absence, as he underwent a series of tests and consultations, Archie's behavior changed dramatically. The Bobcat stopped eating regularly, picking at his food with obvious disinterest. His sleep patterns became erratic, and the staff reported that he would spend hours sitting by the fence of his enclosure, looking toward the parking area as if waiting for Frank's familiar car to appear. The playful, theatrical behaviors that had become his trademark disappeared entirely, replaced by a listless withdrawal that worried everyone at the sanctuary. "He's pining," Dr. Carter told Frank during one of their phone conversations. "I've seen animals mourn the loss of companions before, but I've never seen one react this strongly to a temporary separation from a human caregiver." Frank's own anxiety about the medical tests was compounded by guilt over Archie's condition. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was undergoing treatment to ensure he could continue caring for Archie, but his absence was causing the very distress he was trying to prevent. The tests themselves proved anticlimactic. Frank's symptoms were attributed to stress and the lingering effects of grief, treatable with medication and lifestyle changes rather than the serious conditions his doctors had initially suspected. On the day Frank returned to the sanctuary, Archie's transformation was immediate and dramatic. The Bobcat recognized Frank's car pulling into the parking lot and was at the fence of his enclosure before Frank had even turned off the engine. When Frank approached the enclosure, Archie pressed himself against the chain link, rubbing his head against Frank's hand through the fence and purring so loudly it sounded like a small truck engine. The reunion brought tears to the eyes of everyone present, staff and volunteers alike, who gathered to witness the obvious joy of two friends finding each other again. "I've never seen anything like it," Maria Santos, one of the wildlife rehabilitators, said later. The way he recognized Frank from that distance, the immediate change in his whole demeanor, it was like watching someone come back to life. Frank was deeply moved by this display of loyalty and affection. During his weeks away, undergoing tests and confronting his own mortality, he'd begun to worry that his attachment to Archie was one-sided, that he was projecting his own need for connection onto a wild animal who would be better off learning independence. But Archie's obvious joy at his return convinced Frank that their bond was genuine and mutual, something that transcended the usual boundaries between human and animal. The extent of Archie's devotion became even more apparent during a minor accident that occurred in the sanctuary's outdoor area several weeks later. Frank was helping with maintenance work when he tripped over an uneven piece of ground and fell, scraping his hands and jarring his back, before any of the human staff could reach him. Archie was at the fence of his enclosure, clearly agitated and vocalizing in a way none of them had heard before. When Dr. Carter opened the gate to allow Frank's planned visit to continue, Archie immediately ran to Frank's side, gently pawing at his hand and then positioning himself beside Frank like a living cane not strong enough to actually support Frank's weight, but clearly trying to help in whatever way he could. "He knows you're hurt, Doctor," Carter observed with amazement as she helped Frank to his feet. "Look at how carefully he's moving around you, how he's staying close but not crowding you. It's like he understands exactly what you need." As word of Archie's unusual temperament and his bond with Frank spread through the sanctuary community, Dr. Carter began to notice something remarkable during visits from elderly groups and individuals dealing with various forms of trauma or loss. Archie seemed to possess an intuitive understanding of when extra gentleness was required. During these special visits, his behavior became noticeably more subdued and careful. When an elderly woman with trembling hands reached toward him, Archie would simply raise a paw softly, not demanding anything, just waiting quietly for the touch. He seemed to understand instinctively that these visitors required extra patience and care. Dr. Carter and her staff gradually realized that Archie possessed a gift that went beyond simple tameness or socialization. His sensitivity to human emotions and physical conditions was extraordinary, almost supernatural in its accuracy. Whenever Frank was tired or unwell, Archie was always the first to notice. He would sit closer than usual, purring louder, trying to draw attention to Frank's condition before the humans around them had even noticed anything amiss. The most dramatic example of this sensitivity occurred during a routine reading session when Frank experienced a sudden drop in blood pressure, a side effect of the medication he'd been prescribed following his medical tests. Frank felt dizzy and disoriented, but was trying to hide his discomfort, not wanting to worry the staff or interrupt their busy day. Archie, however, became immediately agitated, pacing his enclosure and vocalizing insistently until Dr. Carter came to investigate. "This little fellow probably saved your life," Dr. Carter told Frank as they waited for the paramedics to arrive and adjust his medication. He knew something was wrong before any of us humans did. His behavior was so unusual, so insistent, that I knew immediately something serious was happening. The incident convinced the entire team that Archie had not only recovered from his physical injuries, but had developed capabilities that went far beyond normal animal behavior. His emotional sensitivity and intuitive understanding of human needs suggested possibilities that none of them had previously considered. The anniversary of Margaret's death had arrived on a gray October morning, exactly 1 year after Frank had lost the woman who had been his companion and anchor for nearly 4 decades. He came to the sanctuary as usual, but instead of settling into their customary reading routine, he found himself unable to concentrate on the printed words. Instead, he sat in silence, looking out over the garden behind the center and clutching an old wool scarf that still carried the faint scent of Margaret's perfume, one of the few possessions of hers that he'd been able to keep close without being overwhelmed by grief. Archie seemed to sense the significance of the day and the weight of Frank's sorrow. Instead of tapping Frank's hand with his paw as he usually did when he wanted attention, the bobcat simply approached quietly and sat beside Frank's chair, without any prompting or invitation. Archie gently placed a paw on Frank's hand, not demanding anything, not seeking comfort for himself, just being present as a silent gesture of condolence and support. They sat together in the quiet morning light, two souls who had both lost their first families and found something new and precious in each other. The autumn sun streamed through the windows, casting patterns of light and shadow that shifted gently across the floor. And Frank felt something he hadn't experienced since Margaret's death, a sense of peace that didn't require him to forget his loss, but allowed him to carry it with grace. As Archie's reputation for gentleness and sensitivity grew, news of the polite bobcat began to spread beyond the immediate community of Cedar Grove Wildlife Sanctuary. Local newspapers picked up the story, fascinated by the unusual bond between the grieving widower and his therapeutic bobcat. Soon, the sanctuary was receiving calls from reporters, animal behaviorists, and researchers curious about this unprecedented relationship. Carter began documenting Archie's interactions with visitors, collecting evidence of his therapeutic abilities. The data was remarkable. Elderly visitors reported feeling calmer and more hopeful after spending time with Archie. Individuals dealing with grief found comfort in his presence. Children with anxiety disorders seemed to relax around him in ways their parents hadn't seen in months. A mental health organization, after reviewing the documented evidence of Archie's work with various populations, made an unprecedented decision. They officially recognized Archie as the first therapeutic bobcat in Vermont's history, acknowledging his unique ability to provide comfort and healing to humans in distress. The recognition came with official certification and opened doors to new opportunities for Archie and Frank to share their gift with even more people who needed healing. Archie seemed to understand his new status and responsibilities instinctively. During visitor tours, he would position himself near the front of his enclosure and gently lift a paw to request pets from guests, a gesture that invariably succeeded in charming even the most skeptical visitors. His technique was flawless, never demanding, never aggressive, simply offering the opportunity for connection to anyone who seemed interested. Dr. Carter began receiving requests from nursing homes, hospice centers, and therapy programs across the region, all hoping to arrange visits with Frank and Archie. The sanctuary developed careful protocols for these outreach sessions, ensuring that Archie's stress levels were monitored and that his own well-being remained the top priority. But the young bobcat seemed to thrive on these encounters, displaying an energy and enthusiasm during the therapeutic visits that he showed at no other time. On Volunteer Appreciation Day at Cedar Grove, Frank was invited to speak about his experience working with Archie. Standing on the small stage in the sanctuary's meeting room, surrounded by staff members, volunteers, and supporters who had become like family to him over the past months, Frank found himself struggling for words. The magnitude of what had happened in his life since that terrible day on Route 202 seemed too large and too precious for simple language. "I don't know what to say," he began, his voice catching with emotion. "6 months ago, I thought my life was over. I couldn't imagine having anything left to give to the world, or any reason to keep getting up in the morning. But this little gentleman here," he gestured toward Archie's enclosure, where the bobcat was visible through the meeting room's large window. He showed me that sometimes the most important work we do comes from our broken places. As Frank fumbled for the right words to express his gratitude, something extraordinary happened. Archie suddenly appeared at the edge of the stage, having somehow made his way from his enclosure through doors that should have been closed. The bobcat had clearly been drawn by the sound of Frank's voice and the gathering of people he had come to know and trust. Without hesitation, Archie walked across the stage with his characteristic dignity, placed his paw gently on Frank's hand, and let out a clear, resonant purr that filled the quiet room. The sound seemed to express everything that Frank had been struggling to put into words: gratitude, love, the miracle of connection across impossible barriers. The audience erupted in spontaneous applause and tears, moved by this simple but profound gesture of support and affection. Frank looked down at Archie, then up at the faces of the people who had helped make their healing journey possible. "I guess Archie wants to say thank you too," Frank managed, his voice thick with emotion. "A year ago, we were both lost, me without Margaret, him without his mother. But somehow, we found each other, and through finding each other, we found all of you and discovered that healing is always possible when we're brave enough to remain open to love." That afternoon, as had become their cherished routine over the past months, Frank sat in his armchair while Archie rested on his cushion nearby. The autumn sun bathed the trees outside the window in gold, creating patterns of light and shadow that shifted gently across the floor of their sitting room. Frank reached over to stroke Archie's ear, marveling as he always did at the softness of the bobcat's fur and the complete trust evident in his relaxed posture. "You know, little gentleman," Frank said softly, his voice carrying all the tenderness he'd once reserved for Margaret. "You're the only creature in this world that made this old heart beat strong again." Archie opened his golden eyes and looked directly at Frank with an expression that seemed to hold all the wisdom of the wild and all the gentleness of domesticated love. Then, with the deliberate grace that characterized all his movements, he placed his paw on Frank's hand and began to purr a sound that seemed to acknowledge in return Frank's declaration of love. The gesture was so tender, so perfectly timed, that Frank felt his eyes fill with tears of gratitude. And that was enough. They didn't need words to communicate the depth of their bond or the completeness of their mutual healing. Just presence, just the quiet miracle of two broken souls who had found wholeness in each other's company. As the seasons continued to turn and their work together deepened, Frank often reflected on the lessons Archie had taught him about the nature of love, loss, and recovery. Connection, he had learned, was something that transcended language, species, even the deepest pain. It was found in the quiet presence during difficult moments, the timely touch that offered comfort without expectation, the steady purr that said, "You are not alone," more clearly than any words ever could. Their story had become a gentle lesson that the world still needed to hear, that healing was always possible, that love could grow in the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the most profound relationships came from the simple decision to remain open to connection, even in the aftermath of devastating loss. An old man and a little bobcat had found each other across the boundaries of species and circumstance, and in doing so, they had discovered that the capacity for love and healing exists wherever there are hearts brave enough to trust again.